Alright, so today we're going to be working on some EP valves. Now what these actually are electronic pressure regulators. So this is more of a regulator than a valve, but everybody around here calls them valves, so that's what we're going to call them. So this is what it is, and this is kind of a custom made thing, so it fits our particular plug. You can see it's got an I here, so this is for your input, and then we've got an E for exhaust and an O for out. On the bottom there's another outlet, so we can either use this or this for our out. I'm going to be using this, so we're going to plug this with this plug. So these things are always extra tight. I'm going to put it in this vise, but I really don't want to do any extra squeeze on it, so I don't want to risk damaging it. So we're going to put the muffler on the exhaust. So essentially whenever that pressure needs to drop, it's got to go somewhere. It's going to go right here. And the muffler is going to help to protect it from any debris that might get in, but more importantly to keep the noise down. This should all be 1/8 inch NPT. All right, now for the input and the output. Now these two, they look exactly the same. They have the exact same model number, but they are a little bit different. So you can see on this one, the exhaust is on the side, whereas this one, the exhaust is on the front. So you do have to pay attention. You can't just say, okay, that looks good, and then put it together the exact same way. So the input's on the front. That is going to be this one. So the 10mm hose going in, this is the input, and then this goes back to the SMC valve block. And then on this side, this is the output that goes to the chucks. Now we could make this pretty easy. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to actually build this thing, and having looked at the Reelstands, they all seem to be built differently. The main concept is we need to have a filter here. So that's this guy. We could just put a T on here if we wanted to. Put this right on top of that, and then put this just with an elbow on top of that. That is an option, but having all these extra fittings does help in case some of the hoses aren't quite aligning properly. It gives you a little bit more room to maneuver, to manipulate this thing so that you can get this thing to fit properly. So we're gonna kind of build it the same way. And I try to get Teflon tape on everything, all the male threads before I install it, just so I don't have to be grabbing this and like spinning the whole thing around whenever I'm putting on the Teflon tape. Now something you can do, because this is nipple, you could put a little bit more Teflon tape on one side, that way it'll be more likely to stick. So that way whenever you pull this whole fitting assembly off, it'll stay on the fitting assembly and not on the regulator. But that's really up to you, however the heck you want to build it. Now it's usually tempting to grab some pliers and twist that on. You really don't want to do that though, because we want to keep those threads in good shape. So I'm going to basically build it exactly like we've got this one here. So we've got, there's our elbow, here's our T, there's our elbow, and then we got two filters. Here's our filter, and you can see it's got that arrow, so the flow goes that direction. All right. Now that is the filter. Technically, it could filter either direction, but it is supposed to go that way. Now if you look at this one, we can see that that's actually wrong, because the flow is going to go that way, but then it's going to come this way. So does that mean that we shouldn't use this? Well, it's hard to argue. I mean, if we blow into it, it will flow either way. It's supposed to go one way, so it's really up to you as to how you want to put that. The only one that's really important is this one right here, because this is where the input is actually going to come from. So we need to have one here. We don't necessarily need to have one here. So this fitting is a push to connect 10 millimeter, but it is a 1/8 universal thread. So this isn't a tapered thread, so this is not going to seal through a taper. It's going to seal by pressing against this ring right here. So do I need to put Teflon tape on here? The answer is no, but I'm going to anyway, just to make it a little bit better of a seal. I would have gotten an 1/8 inch NPT to 10 millimeter, but I could not find one. So that's why I'm using the universal thread. This one comes with pipe dope already on it, so I don't need to put Teflon on there. And this is our 6 millimeter fitting. Now the thing about these fittings is that I'm using a 10, an 8, and a 6, and that's just because those are the hoses that are the most common. But I have seen where they've changed those out, so I might have a 10 going in and a 10 going out. I think that's probably one of the better reasons, just to use a nice adapter right here, so that no matter what type of fitting that you actually need to put on, you can just take that off and put on whatever you really need. But I'm pre-building it like this so that I can hopefully just quickly swap this out for whatever I need. So I want to have it so the hoses are pointing away, because it's going to be mounting, and then the hoses are going to be coming in from this direction. And then I just want to have it twisted up. And we don't want to go too tight on it because these are brass, but we do want to have it tight enough to where it's not going to leak. All right. So that is what that looks like. And then the last thing is our 8 millimeter output. And for this, I'm just using an elbow because that way all the hoses can come in from the same direction. I have seen these built where they have a filter here as well, but it seems like a bad idea, just because we want to make sure that we have this pressure able to drop off or increase very, very quickly. And if you put a filter here, that's going to restrict the flow, and it's going to make it so it might stay tight for too long, or it might release too slow, and that could cause tension problems on the reel stand. So this is the whole thing fully assembled. We got our 10 millimeter hose input here, our 6 millimeter hose output here, so it's just going to flow straight through, and then our 8 millimeter output to the reel stand. And on the other side, we got our filter. So you can see how that looks a little bit different from our old one. Just got to make sure that you're lining up everything on here properly. And then the last thing is the mounting bracket. So when we mount this can actually mount like this or like this. Where it's going to be sitting on the reel stand, the hoses are going to be pointing that direction, and it's going to mount essentially like this. So we just need to line all that up and drop these 4 bolts in. Okay, so that is the fully assembled regulator. So we got our ground, which is this one right up here. Then we got our power, so this is going to provide 24 volts to our regulator. And then this is the command signal. So this is going to provide somewhere between 0 and 10 volts to tell this thing to regulate that pressure down depending on the amount of voltage that it gets. The way we calibrate it is under here. So there are those 2 little potentiometers in there. This one on the right, or closest to the middle of the oval, that's the span, and then this one closer to the side is the Z or the 0. And the reason that's important is because on our old regulators, this is everything that we're taking out and we're replacing with those new ones. We got those same potentiometers, but they are actually labeled Z and S. So keeping that uniform can help to reduce confusion. There is one thing about this one that's a little bit different, and that is that the 0 and the span, on this one it's lefty-tighty, so the more you turn it counterclockwise, the higher the pressure. On the new ones, you turn it clockwise to increase the pressure, so there is that. So to understand what we're doing with this, right here we've got 0 volts, and over here we've got 10 volts. So we've got 80 psi pressure that we're going to be putting in, and then we use this to regulate what's actually been coming out. If we want half of the pressure coming out, so 40 psi, then we would put in 5 volts. So that's halfway between 0 and 10. If we want 60 psi, we would put in 7.5 volts. If we want 20 psi, we would put 2.5 volts. So when we're calibrating this, we can adjust the span, which is how far apart the psi is going to be, or we can adjust the 0, which is going to be in what direction we want to favor. Now, if we have the span set here to between 2 and 6 volts, then we get 1 volt, it's going to be off. If we put in 7 volts, it's going to be full on max. So we want to increase the span so that it covers the full range, and we want to make sure that it's not offset. So this is the 0, we're adjusting where that is, and then this is the span. And so for this, we're going to be playing with another invention that Frank made. This is the power. This needs 24 volts power. Right about there. And we're using the black wire as negative. And the white wire is positive. This is a Fluke 112, and the only important thing here is that we need to have a multimeter that can read millivolts, because we're going to be using this. It has a transducer on the end of it, and we just put on a quick coupler. And this can read pressure, so this is essentially just a pressure gauge, but a very high quality pressure gauge. We're putting this on PSI, and that plugs right into the multimeter. And we got a fancy multimeter here. This is a Simpson. It's an oldie but a goodie. And we're going to use that to make sure we're getting 24 volts. So there we go. So we're looking at this gauge on the top. So right now this is 20, 21, 22, 23. Just fine tune that a little bit. Okay, so we are at 24 volts right now. So now I can take these probes and I'll put it in our 10 volt reading. So the point of this is going to be to check to see what voltage we're actually putting in, and that's going to be what we're using this meter for. And then this meter is going to show us our PSI readout. So we're going to plug the transducer into our output. So that's our blue line. Then we're going to plug our input in here. There is our output. And then the cable plugs in right here in the top. Now we don't want it leaking right here. I just got this little plug that we can stick in there. Now we'll put it on our air supply. And this is connected right to a regulator. So we want to have this set to 80 psi. So now I'll just switch it on. So the way this box is set up is the power comes in from the power supply, and then it goes to this rheostat, and it branches off from the rheostat to this cable and to the output here. So we can read what the actual voltage is coming off of the rheostat, so we know exactly what we're feeding the regulator. And then if I turn this on, so we can read it like this, but I'm just going to hit range a couple of times so that we can see that we are 8 millivolts, which means 8 psi. So I need to set this to 10 volts. So now it's going to be reading 0 to 10. And if I bring up the volts, now we're at max. So we got 80 psi and 10 volts. All right, so I'm at 8 volts and it didn't drop at all. Right there is 5 volts, and I'm at 47 psi. So I should be at 40 psi. So I'm going to start out by adjusting the span, because I know that we need to extend that out a little bit. All right, so now we're at 40 psi at 5 volts. And if I bring this up, we're at 7.5 volts. We got 60 psi. And right there, we're at 79 psi. So I need to decrease that a little bit, but let's just see what our bottom range is. All right, so we're at -3. So we are pretty close. And now, theoretically, I could just leave it right here, because if we're within a couple of psi, then we're good. But I want to make this a little bit better. So at 2.5 volts, we're getting 20 psi. Okay, a little bit less than that. So I'm going to drop our span a little bit so that it reaches that max a little bit sooner. There we go. All right, at 5 volts, we're at 42 psi. We're still not quite getting our 80 psi. And it is also worth mentioning that it's possible that this regulator isn't set correctly, and if it's not, then we're not going to get our 80 psi. Yeah, I'm going to decrease that span just a little bit more. There we go. So we're getting our 80 at 10 now, and at 7.5, we're a little bit over 60. At 5 volts, we're at 40. Two and a half, we're at 20. And at 0 volts, we got negative pressure. So this is perfect. This is right where we want to be. And the way we've got this set up right now is we got a 10 millimeter with an 8 millimeter reducer. So we can take that out. We can stick our 10 millimeter in here. So no matter what kind of fitting we have, we can just kind of swap that out. What that can also be good for is if we want to confirm that this regulator is working properly, we can just plug this directly in. And we can see we got 80 psi. So we are set properly here. If we ever weren't, we can just move this. And as we drop this regulator, we'll see our output change right there. But if nothing else, we can at least confirm that we are at the right psi. So that's it. This one's done. It's ready to install.